You're familiar with this December 21st, 2012, this apparent Mayan prediction of the end of the world. People have heard about this? No? People haven't heard about this? Okay, if you haven't heard about it, here's something we can put on our calendar for December 21st, just right on it, the world ends. Well, I've heard this little story of, from several thousand years ago about two Mayans, and I thought I'd share it this morning. Mayan number 1 says, "Okay guys, I've finished the calendar." And Mayan number 2 says, "But it only goes up to 21.12.2012. Mayan number 1 replies, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'm sure we'll have time to make a new one before then. I would have carried on this stone, but I just ran out of room." Mayan number 2 says, "Fair enough. Hey, imagine if people thought that the world was going to end just because you couldn't find a bigger stone." And Mayan number 1 replies, "Yeah, but you'd have to be pretty stupid to think that, wouldn't you?" I thought it was kind of a cute story where they're trying to sort of poke fun at this idea, because basically what had happened was that the Mayans had put together this elaborate calendar. I don't pretend to understand how it all works, and I'm not into astronomy too much and how that all sort of worked out. But essentially they ran out of room, and eventually, you know, this calendar sort of ends at that date. And so people have come over the years to interpret that as meaning, oh, that means time is up. That means the end is near. It's interesting because every culture has some kind of what we call an eschatology. Eschatology has to do with how things will end and when things will end. And it's really interesting, I think, because even today there are particular kinds of eschatology out there. But especially when we go back to biblical times, and the scriptures that we read even this morning have an eschatological element to them. Eschatology is most often, almost always, born out of situations of suffering and injustice. Eschatology manifests the longing for the day when things will be better, when evil, both systemic and personal, is destroyed. And it expresses a kind of a longing for that day. Because all around, our systems, our nations, our people doing horrible things. And oftentimes the people were suffering themselves, and so this longing came for a better day, a brighter day, and that one day this world would end and a new world would begin. Now, I think we can all understand to a certain degree that longing. And I think there are different situations and circumstances that we might long for something. I'll use one lighthearted example. This week I was reminded even more so, the deep longing to have a sports team to believe in. Because it's been so long, Toronto sports fans, and yes, the Argos are having a playoff game this afternoon. You know, we can give thanks for that. But I mean, aside from that, when, you know, the last time we've had a team in the playoffs, and so this week the Blue Jays are all over the news because they made big trades and took on all kinds of high salaried players in order to make a legitimate run at making the playoffs next year. And I have to admit, it was pretty distracting because I was so excited, which reminded me all the more of how long suffering it's been as Toronto sports fans. Longing for the day will be relevant again. Hopefully that day is upon us. We'll find out. But in more serious situations, we know that there can be a longing. Longing for a parent who has a child that won't sleep through the night, longing for the day the child will settle down and sleep will begin. Parents of teenagers may be longing for the day when the difficult, rocky time of adolescence would be over. Perhaps at work, longing for the day when companies will no longer understaff and overwork its employees, and we long for that day. Perhaps as a student, we might be in the midst of exams and other types of stressful times, and we long for the day to find that relief when that was over. This week, we're also reminded soberly of the realities of war and in the Middle East, and of Israel and Gaza and the Hamas continually at war. Think about what it must be like to be the people living under those circumstances and longing for the day when the war ends, when the fighting ends. Longing for that day when injustices are over. We might put ourselves in the position of a prisoner longing for the day to be free, to taste the sunlight again. We might also think or be experiencing a time of illness, longing for a day when the difficult, painful treatments will be over. We might be a caregiver on the other end of that, longing for the day when that trial will end, when healing happens, when we can find peace and rest again. I think we know what it's like to long for the day. Well, the New Testament writers had a very particular kind of eschatology. I'll talk a few minutes about that this morning. In Mark's eschatology, the author of the gospel we heard this morning, Jesus speaks of the destruction of the temple, the center of Jewish worship. He speaks of the destruction of that temple, of wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, etc., as signs before the end comes. Now, the Markan community, those that would have received and perhaps participated in writing Mark's Gospel, lived in troubled times. Some scholars believe they may have even been around that time when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D., when the church was being persecuted, when the Jewish people were being persecuted and oppressed by a cruel empire. So all around them they could see suffering and buildings burning and people begging for food on the streets. And so they were longing for that to be over, longing for the end. But there's also two things I'd like to highlight about the sense of the end or the day. The first is that the end is also just a beginning. The end isn't just an end of it all, but it is a beginning. Jesus is talking about these things, and then he says, but these are just the beginning of the birth pangs. He likens the situation to like a woman in labor, an excruciating pain that comes before new life, that comes before the joy of a new child. In understanding their situation and suffering in this light, they're trying to find meaning to their suffering, meaning in their circumstance. And I believe it derives from an understanding of the pattern that Christ himself manifested. That pattern, that suffering comes before new life. That trial and challenge come before victory and triumph and peace. We know this from Jesus' own life and how he lived and how he suffered at the hands of the authorities, was nailed to the cross, buried in the ground, and on the third day rises to new life. The Markan community were seeing themselves in that light, as being connected with Christ in that way. And what it does is it gives them and it gives us hope and faith that things will be restored, that one day injustice will be over. And it gives them motivation then to stay sharp, to endure, and even to rise to the occasion. To not just be victims of circumstance, but rather to find meaning and hope and purpose in the midst of that time and to step up. The author to the Hebrews talks about that. That last line talks about, as you see the day approaching, that day is in reference again, sort of to the end, to the return of Christ. And just before that, we have the author admonishing the people, the Christian community. He says, let us consider how to provoke one another to love. We think of provoking, we probably think of it in positive terms. Think about provoking others to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. It's always interesting, isn't it, that encouraging people to come to church has been a problem for 2,000 years in the church's community. But encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. There's this sense of that when we have an idea about the end, that it brings meaning to the present. Think about the movie The Bucket List. You know, the idea that when we know that our life will be over soon, we want to seize the day and make the most of every day. How would we spend that time if we knew exactly? If December 21st was the end of the world, as the people think the Mayans predicted, what would these next days, this next month or so, look like for you? What would you do? What would you work on? You might spend time having experiences that you've always wanted to do, a bucket list. Probably most of us would want to spend as much time with family and friends as we could. Others of us might think, you know what, I've only got this many days left, I'm going to do good before I go. I'm going to do as many good deeds as I can. And I think it's just something that we lose track of. We think about the end, we think about it fearfully perhaps. But the early Christians were encouraged to think about it as a way to provoke them into action. And so it ought to be for us. Now the second thing I'd like to say about that, the day, is that it's not so much about a point in time, like December 21st, as it is about a person. Now let's think about this. The ending and the beginning. What does that sound like? Alpha and Omega. The first and the last letter of the Greek alphabet. And we read in the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ is identified as the Alpha and the Omega. Sometimes we use those terms and we don't think about what it might mean. I think it refers to the fact that Jesus is at the beginning, and we have that in creation through the Word, that all things came into creation through Jesus Christ, who is the Word made flesh. John chapter 1 talks a lot about that. But Jesus is also present and active at the end. We read Revelation, we hear about that, and the victory and Christ's triumph over all evil, and active in the recreation of the earth. And so that day is about this person. It's about Jesus Christ, who Hebrews calls the high priest and the sacrifice. That day anticipates the incarnation, where that person of Christ comes to be with us, and we celebrate that at Christmas. Next week is Christ the King Sunday, or we celebrate the reign of Christ. And it's sort of a preview of what's to come, because it happens right before the season of Advent starts, in order to give us a kind of a picture of Jesus, so that when we go through Advent, we recognize that longing we have for God's presence to be with us. We have a sense, living today as Christians, what that looks like, because we have Jesus with us. We know that all the time. But we enter into the season to put ourselves in the place of the people of God who were longing, who were hoping for things to be right. And we understand that we're also longing for those things, longing for Christ to come, yearning for God to be with us in new ways and in a special way. And so today, sort of before these special weeks, we are invited to join with the Markan community and all the early Christian communities who long for that day, when every tear will be wiped away, when conflicts cease, when the King shall come again. But we also recognize that Christ has already come, that in a sense the end is already upon us. The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, lives within us and resides with us. And so that ought to inspire us or provoke us to love and good deeds. And what an appropriate Sunday for us to have that theme, as we are blessed to have Mary McAdam with us to share about the ways in which, as a people, as a church, that we are striving for good deeds, for justice, to make a difference in the world, to reach out to others. It's also the day that Out of the Cold starts tonight. A very active and wonderful program that takes place to reach out, to do good in the world, to provide hospitality and compassion to those in need. And so for all of us this morning, may we be provoked to love and action. And may we, no matter what our circumstances, find ourselves in a position to hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is indeed faithful. Amen.